The North Vietnamese Army intelligence reports from 1968 were brutally simple. They listed the CH-47 as the highest priority target. The reasoning held up in theory. The helicopter moved at 120 miles per hour. That is slower than a car on the highway. It was loud. The twin rotors created a distinctive acoustic signature that carried for miles, and it was huge. The fuselage stretched nearly 60 feet long. To the Viet Cong gunners, hiding in the jungle canopy, it looked less like a piece of modern aviation and more like a slow-moving truck with wings. Destroying the Chinook seemed straightforward. The vulnerability was real. The consequence was different. The enemy commanders understood the tactical picture better than many American planners did. They knew that destroying one Chinook did not stop the war. It only delayed the next one. The real weakness was not the helicopter itself. It was the dependency. The American Army had built its entire logistics strategy around this single airframe. Without it, the supply lines collapsed. History often glosses over the mechanical realities of war. Subscribe for the unvarnished details. Comment if you have flown or maintained these aircraft. We need to keep the record accurate. The NVA called it a flying coffin in their internal assessments, not because they feared it, but because they knew how many men died inside it. They watched the landing zones from the tree line. They counted the troops. They saw the crates. The Chinook could lift 7 tons of cargo. That is the weight of 3 M11 tanks, or enough ammunition to supply a battalion for a week. The enemy misjudged the American response. They assumed the Americans would protect the helicopters by keeping them away from the front. They did not realize the Americans would risk them exactly because they were indispensable. The Chinook was not a luxury, it was the lifeline. Every flight was a gamble. Every landing zone was a potential trap. The Soviets had tried similar heavy-lift concepts in the Korean War. The outcomes varied, but in Vietnam, the terrain demanded air mobility. There were no roads. The jungle swallowed trucks. The Chinook was the only thing that could move men and material through the green hell. The enemy gunners learned to aim for the tail rotor. A direct hit there meant instant loss of control. The helicopter would spin and drop. The crashes were violent. Fireballs rose into the humid air. The sound of tearing metal was distinct. But the next day, another Chinook would arrive, and another. The system absorbed the losses. It kept moving. The enemy could kill the machine. They could not kill the need. So why risk the machine at all? The answer lies in the mud. The American Army arrived in Vietnam with a doctrine built for open fields and paved roads. They brought heavy equipment, armored vehicles, and a logistical tail that stretched back to the United States. But the terrain refused to cooperate. The jungle was not a battlefield. It was a digestive system. It swallowed trucks, rotted tires, and turned dirt roads into impassable swamps within hours of the first rain. The monsoon season lasted for months. During those months, the roads became rivers. A single landslide could cut off a battalion for weeks. The supply trucks sat idle. The drivers watched the mud rise. The troops waited. Hunger and frustration set in. The army needed a way to move weight, not just men. Weight. Enter the CH-47 Chinook. Boeing designed it with a tandem rotor system. 2 massive rotors spinning in opposite directions. No tail rotor. This configuration allowed for incredible lift capacity. The Chinook could carry 7 tons. That is more than 2 UH-1 Hueys combined. It could lift a light tank, carry a howitzer, or move entire squads with their gear in a single flight. The Huey was the workhorse. Everyone knows the Huey. It carried troops, provided fire support, and remained agile. But it had limits. The Huey could not lift heavy cargo, move artillery pieces, or resupply a forward base with the volume needed to sustain combat operations. The Chinook filled that gap. It was the heavy lifter, the muscle. Critics argued that the Chinook was too big, too vulnerable, and too expensive. They said it should be kept away from the front lines, used only for strategic airlift. The Army disagreed. They needed the lift at the tactical level. They needed to drop ammunition at Landing Zone X, evacuate wounded soldiers from the middle of nowhere, and move construction equipment to build new bases. The Chinook was the only option. The pilots knew the risks. They flew into valleys where the terrain masked radar. They flew through firefights. They landed on slopes that defied physics. The airframe was tough. It could take hits, but it was not invincible. The vulnerability was real. The cost was high, yet the Army kept pushing. They pushed both the Chinook and the pilots to their limits. The strategy was simple. Keep moving, keep supplying, keep the war going. The Chinook was the engine of that strategy. Without it, the Army would have been stuck. The logistics would have collapsed. The troops would have been stranded. The enemy understood this. They targeted the Chinook because they knew it was the key. They wanted to break the supply chain and isolate the American forces, but they underestimated the resilience of the system. The Chinook crews adapted, developing new tactics like night flights, smoke screens, and close coordination with ground troops. The losses were heavy, but the flow of supplies continued. This was not a victory of technology alone. It was a victory of persistence. The Chinook was a tool, a blunt instrument, but it was the only instrument that worked. The army accepted the risk because the alternative was worse: stagnation, defeat. The Chinook flew into the hell because someone had to. The records show the numbers: thousands of sorties, tons of cargo delivered, hundreds of lives lost. The math is brutal, but it is honest. The Chinook was necessary, dangerous, and indispensable. The crews knew this. They flew anyway. They did their jobs. They kept the war moving. The jungle, the enemy, and the weather tried to stop them. Nothing worked. The Chinook kept coming, going, and lifting. The weight of the war was on its rotors, and it held. The machine was a masterpiece of engineering. It was also a death trap. Boeing designers solved the lift problem by creating a helicopter that could carry more weight than anything else in the sky. But they achieved this by making the aircraft huge. In a war fought in the trees, huge is a liability. The CH-47 had a wingspan of 46 feet. That is wider than a single-family home. It presented a target that was impossible to miss. The enemy did not need good aim. They just needed to shoot in the general direction of the noise. The fuel system was the real killer. The designers placed the main fuel tanks in the fuselage, assuming the metal skin would protect them. It did not. A single round from a Soviet-made RPD light machine gun could pierce the aluminum. The fuel would leak, the fumes would fill the cabin, and then, inevitably, something would spark. The fire spread fast. The crew had seconds to bail out. Many did not make it. The report from the Air Force Safety Center called the tank placement unacceptable. Their word, not mine. They recommended armored plating. The Army ignored it. Armor added weight. Weight reduced lift. The math of war is cruel. You choose what you sacrifice. The Army chose speed and capacity over protection. You might think the pilots could avoid the fire. They could not. The rotors were slow to stop. If the engine failed, the helicopter dropped like a stone, offering no glide and no grace, just gravity. The tandem rotor system provided incredible stability. It also provided zero forgiveness for damage to the transmission. A hit to the gearbox meant instant death. The gearbox sat right behind the pilot's seat. One bullet there and the rotors would lock. The helicopter would spin out of control. The sound of the gears stripping was a high-pitched scream. It was the last thing many pilots heard. The British had tried something similar in Malaya. They used helicopters to move troops through the jungle. The results were mixed. While the terrain and enemy differed, the lesson remained the same. Helicopters are vulnerable. The British learned to fly low and fast. The Americans learned to fly low and pray. The tactics were similar. The outcomes were not. The British did not face the same volume of fire or the same sophistication in anti-aircraft weapons. The comparison is flawed, but it highlights the uniqueness of the Vietnam experience. The intensity was unprecedented. The pressure on the aircrews was constant. The margin for error was non-existent. Anyway, but that's beside the point. The real issue was the silhouette. The Chinook was easy to spot. It was easy to track, and it was easy to hit. The gunners used simple rangefinders. They estimated distance based on the size of the target. The bigger the target, the easier the calculation. The Chinook was the biggest target in the sky. It was a beacon for the enemy. The pilots knew this. They flew close to the ground. They hugged the terrain. They used the valleys for cover. But the jungle was dense. The visibility was poor. And the enemy was waiting. The vulnerability was not just physical. It was psychological. The crew knew they were sitting in a bomb, with ticking fuel and thin armor. The trust in the machine was fragile. It was held together by skill and luck. The pilots were experts. They understood the aircraft. They knew its limits. They pushed those limits every day. The maintenance crews kept the machines flying. They worked through the night. They fixed what they could. They replaced what they had to. The parts were scarce. The tools were limited. But they kept the Chinooks in the air. The design flaws were evident from the start. Engineers, the Army, and the pilots all knew the risks and accepted them. The alternative was not to fly. The alternative was to lose the war. The calculation was cold, logical, and brutal. The Chinook was a tool, a dangerous tool, but it was the only tool that worked. The crews used it. They survived. They died. They kept flying. The records show the damage, bullet holes, burn marks, and twisted metal. The stories are consistent. The fear was real. But so was the duty. The pilots did not complain. They did not quit. They flew. They delivered the cargo. They evacuated the wounded. They supported the troops. They performed their jobs well, under fire, and against the odds. The Chinook was a coffin. But it was a coffin that flew. And in Vietnam, that made all the difference. The enemy could shoot it down. They could not stop it. The flow continued. The war continued. The Chinook kept lifting. The weight of the conflict rested on those rotors, and they held. The official loss rate for the CH-47 stood at 1.2% per 1,000 flight hours. That number sounds small. It is a statistic. It fits on a slide. To a general in a tent with air conditioning, it appears manageable. But statistics do not bleed, scream, or leave families waiting by the phone. The 1.2% was not a flat line. It was a cliff. You either crossed it or you fell. And in Vietnam, the cliff was always right there, hidden in the tree line, waiting for the pilot who got complacent. The crew called it a flying coffin. They did not use the term lightly. It was not a joke. It was an observation. The aircraft was a box of aluminum and fuel, flying through a valley filled with men who wanted to kill them. The vulnerability was absolute. Armor could not stop the bullet, and no shield could block the rocket. There was only the skill of the pilot and the luck of the draw. The term spread quickly through the units. It became part of the culture, serving as a badge of honor, a warning, and a prayer. You might think the crews were terrified. They were not. They were professional. They knew the risks. They accepted them. Fear is a luxury they could not afford. Instead of panic, there was focus. Their attention was sharp, intense, and unblinking. The pilots studied the maps. They memorized the terrain. They practiced the emergency procedures until they were muscle memory. The loadmasters checked the cargo straps. The gunners scanned the perimeter. Every movement was deliberate. Every second counted. They were not heroes. They were workers. Dangerous workers. But workers nonetheless. The cost was high. The records are clear. Hundreds of crews died. Thousands were wounded. The wreckage of the Chinooks littered the jungle floor with twisted metal, burnt rotors, and shattered glass. The evidence of the sacrifice is everywhere. But the mission continued. The supplies arrived. The troops were lifted. The war went on. The indispensability of the Chinook meant that the losses were not just tolerated. They were expected. The system was designed to absorb the pain, keep moving, and keep fighting. The French had faced similar problems in Indochina. They tried to use aircraft to move supplies through the jungle. The results were disastrous. The terrain was too dense, the enemy too well hidden, and the losses too high. The French withdrew. The Americans stayed. The difference was not just technology, it was will. The American crews were willing to pay the price. They knew the odds. They flew anyway. The comparison is stark. The French chose survival. The Americans chose victory. Or at least, they chose to keep trying. Anyway, but that's beside the point. The real story is not about the French. It is about the men in the cockpit. The men who looked at the map and saw death, who looked at the horizon and saw fire, and who looked at their crew and saw brothers. They did not think about the war. They thought about the job, the next landing zone, the next lift, the next flight. The simplicity of the task masked the complexity of the danger. They were experts. They knew the machine, the sky, and the enemy, and they knew that every flight could be the last. The tension was constant. It did not spike and fade. It was a low hum, a vibration in the air carried by the sound of the rotors, the smell of the fuel, the heat of the cabin, the sweat on the brow, the silence between the words, and the unspoken understanding. This is what it meant to fly the Chinook, to be indispensable, vulnerable, and alive. The cost was not just measured in lives. It was measured in spirit, in nerve, and in the willingness to face the coffin every day. The mission success rate was high. The cargo was delivered. The troops were saved. The bases were supplied. The war continued. The statistics show the balance. The losses were heavy, but the gains were heavier. The Chinook was the backbone of the American effort. Without it, the strategy would have failed. The troops would have starved. The lines would have collapsed, and the enemy would have won. The crews knew this. They flew to prevent it. They flew to ensure that the weight of the war did not crush them. They held the line, the sky, and each other. The records do not capture the fear. They do not capture the courage. They capture the numbers, the hours flown, the tons lifted, and the men lost. The math is cold, but the reality is human. The men in the flying coffins were not numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. They died doing their jobs. They lived doing their jobs. They did not ask for glory. They asked for survival, and often they got it. The cost of indispensability is high, but it is a cost worth paying for the mission, the country, and each other. The Chinook flew, lifted, delivered, died, and lived. The story is not over. It is just a chapter, a heavy and necessary one. Kei-san sat on a plateau. It was a flat, rocky shelf rising from the jungle floor, surrounded by steep slopes that dropped away into the green hell below. The base was isolated, cut off by the enemy on 3 sides. The sea was the only escape, and even that was contested. The terrain offered no natural cover. The plateau was open, exposed, a perfect kill box for anyone who could bring fire to bear. The air at Kei-san was thick. It smelled of cordite and wet earth, mixed with rotting vegetation. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders and soaking the uniforms until every movement became a struggle. The heat did not break. It lingered, day and night, turning the base into a sweatbox. The soldiers moved through the mud with a slow, deliberate pace, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary exertion. The jungle watched them. It never blinked. The sound was constant. It was not just the artillery. The hum of generators, the roar of helicopters, the crackle of radios, and the distant thump of mortars filled the air. The noise never stopped. It became a backdrop to life, a white noise that the men learned to ignore. But it was always there, a reminder of the siege and the isolation, the constant danger. The Chinooks arrived in the early morning, their rotors chopping the mist, their shadows stretching long across the landing zone. They brought supplies, news, and hope, and then they left, returning to the sky, leaving the men to wait for the next run. The NVA had surrounded the base. They dug in, built tunnels, laid mines, and waited. The siege was not a battle. It was a pressure cooker. The Americans held the center while the enemy held the perimeter, the space between them filled with fire. The Chinooks flew into the center, landing to unload cargo before lifting off and flying out. The cycle repeated, day after day, week after week. The rhythm was mechanical and relentless, the heartbeat of the siege. The pilots knew the route, the threats, and the timing. They flew low and fast, using the terrain for cover and avoiding known gun positions. The loadmasters secured the cargo, checked the straps, and prepared for the landing. The gunners scanned the perimeter, watching for movement or signs of attack. The tension was high. It was a quiet tension that whispered rather than screamed, like the sound of a man holding his breath. The supplies were critical: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. The base could not sustain itself. It needed the Chinooks. The Chinooks were the lifeline. Without them, Kei-san would fall. The men knew this. They watched the helicopters with a mixture of gratitude and fear, grateful for the supplies but fearful for the pilots. The pilots were heroes. They were also targets. The NVA wanted them dead. They shot at the Chinooks with everything they had: RPGs, machine guns, and mortars. The sky was filled with fire. The helicopters danced through it, dodging and weaving as they landed and left, surviving. The sensory experience of Kei-san was overwhelming. The dust coated everything. It got into the food, water, skin, and lungs. It was everywhere. The soldiers coughed, spat, and wiped it away, but it always returned. The noise was deafening. Explosions shook the ground while the air vibrated with the impact. The men worked through it, building bunkers and digging foxholes to prepare for the next attack. The Chinooks arrived, delivered the goods, and left. The cycle continued. The siege held. The base held. The men held. The Chinooks were the glue. They held the pieces together, kept the war going, and kept the hope alive. The cost was high. The risk was absolute, but the mission was clear: hold the line, ground, and sky. The Chinooks did their job. They flew into the hell, brought the light, and came home. The resupply runs shifted. The sky over the DMZ turned black with steel. Operation Linebacker began in May of 1972, a massive bombing campaign designed to break the will of Hanoi. But for the CH-47 crews, the war did not look like strategic bombing. It looked like a funnel. A narrow, deadly corridor of fire that they had to fly through, again and again, to keep the troops on the ground alive. The NVA had adapted, building a wall of anti-aircraft guns that stretched from the coast to the mountains. That wall was thick and relentless. It did not care about the politics of the war. It only cared about destroying the aircraft. The Chinooks flew low, very low. They hugged the treetops, using the canopy as cover. The pilots had to see the ground to avoid the trees. The trees were as deadly as the guns. A single branch could shear a rotor blade. A single snag could bring the heavy machine down. The margin for error was inches. The pilots relied on their eyes and instincts, backed by the skill of their crew. The loadmasters watched the instruments, ready to call out any deviation. The gunners scanned the horizon, looking for the muzzle flashes that signaled incoming fire. The tension in the cabin pressed against the walls, squeezing the air from the lungs. The sound of the anti-aircraft fire was distinct. It was not the sharp crack of small arms. It was a deep, rolling thunder that shook the airframe. The shells exploded around the helicopter, creating shockwaves that rattled the teeth and blurred the vision. The crew learned to distinguish between the near misses and the direct hits. The near misses were loud and bright. They flashed with orange light and filled the cabin with smoke and dust. The direct hits were silent. They just ended everything. The crew prayed for the noise. The noise meant they were still flying. You might think the pilots were reckless. They were not. They were precise. They flew with a cold, calculated efficiency. They knew the routes, the gun positions, and the timing. They flew through the gaps in the fire, using the terrain to mask their approach. The NVA had hundreds of guns and thousands of rounds, holding the advantage of position. The Americans had the advantage of air, but air is fragile. Air can be shot down. The pilots knew this. They flew with a sense of urgency, a need to get in and out before the guns could track them. The flight was a dance, a dangerous, deadly dance. The technical challenge was immense. The CH-47 was heavy. It was slow to turn. It was slow to accelerate. It required a clear path to land. The NVA knew this. They concentrated their fire on the landing zones. The pilots had to find a spot that was clear of fire and clear of obstacles. The spot had to be flat, stable, and safe. In the chaos of the battlefield, such spots were rare. The pilots often had to land on slopes, on mud, or on debris. The landing was rough. The helicopter bounced and slid. The crew held on, bracing for the impact. The cargo had to be unloaded quickly. The men on the ground were waiting. The clock was ticking. The fire was closing in. The sensory details of the flight were overwhelming. Cordite and burnt fuel filled the cabin, while intense heat radiated from the engines. The deafening noise of the rotors and constant vibration of the airframe created a physical assault on the senses. The crew wore headsets to communicate, but the noise penetrated anyway. The pilots had to focus. They had to ignore pain, fear, and fatigue. They had to fly the machine. They had to deliver the cargo. They had to bring the crew home. The NVA was competent, skilled, and motivated. They fought with a determination that was hard to match. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They held their ground. They fired until their guns were hot and their barrels were warped. The American pilots respected them. They knew they were fighting men who were just as brave, just as skilled, and just as committed as they were. The respect was mutual. It was a respect born of combat, of survival, of the shared experience of death. The cost of the resupply runs was high. The loss rate was significant. The crews were tired. They were worn out. They were stretched to the limit, but they kept flying. They kept delivering. They kept supporting the troops. The mission was clear. The objective was simple. Keep the war going. Keep the men alive. Keep the line holding. The Chinooks were the lifeline. Without them, the war would have stalled. The troops would have starved. The bases would have fallen. The enemy would have won. The crews knew this. They flew to prevent it. The records show the numbers. The hours flown. The tons lifted. The men lost. The math is cold, but the reality is human. The men in the flying coffins were not numbers. They were fathers, sons, and brothers. They died doing their jobs. They lived doing their jobs. They did not ask for glory. They asked for survival. And often, they got it. The cost of indispensability is high, but it is a cost worth paying for the mission, the country, and each other. The Chinook flew, lifted, delivered, and survived. The story is not over. It is just a chapter, a heavy and necessary one. The TOW missile launcher sat mounted on the sponson. It was a clumsy, awkward appendage attached to the side of the CH-47 fuselage. The weapon weighed over 200 pounds. It required a dedicated crewman to operate. It turned a heavy lift transport into a gunship. The concept was born of desperation. The Army needed more firepower. The A-1 Cobra was in short supply. The CH-47 was everywhere. The logic was simple. If you have a truck and you need a tank, put a tank gun on the truck. The resulting vehicle was the ACH-47 Go-Go Bird. It was not a triumph of engineering. It was a testament to the sheer will to fight. The Go-Go Bird was ugly. It was a compromise. The missile launcher protruded from the side, creating drag. The crewman had to lean out of the door to fire, leaving him exposed to small arms fire, the wind, and death. The pilot had to fly a heavy, unbalanced aircraft with poor handling, sluggish acceleration, and non-existent maneuverability. The aircraft was a sitting duck. The name Go-Go Bird was ironic. It did not go fast or far. It went into the line of fire and stayed there. You might think the crews were proud of the upgrade. They were not. They were wary. They knew the aircraft was vulnerable and the mission was suicide. The Go-Go Bird was not designed for combat. It was designed for logistics. The airframe was not reinforced for the stress of gunship maneuvers. The engines were not rated for the power required to escape an ambush. The crew was not trained for the intensity of a gunship fight. The mismatch was glaring. The Army ignored it. The mission required it. The crews flew it anyway. The first operational deployment of the Go-Go Bird was in 1972. The units were scattered. The tactics were unrefined. The crews had to learn on the job. They learned quickly that while the TOW missile was accurate and effective, the aircraft itself was a target. The NVA saw the Go-Go Bird coming. Knowing it was slow, heavy, and vulnerable, they waited for it, fired at it, and killed it. The sensory experience of flying the Go-Go Bird was distinct. The missile launcher added weight to the side, causing the aircraft to list slightly. The pilot had to compensate with constant input. The crewman in the door felt the wind rushing past, the vibration of the engines, and the recoil of the missile. He smelled the cordite. He heard the snap of the bullet. He saw the tracer rounds coming back. The tension was high. The fear was real. The professionalism was absolute. The crews did their job. They fired their missiles, hit their targets, and tried to go home. The records show the results. The Go-Go Bird was effective. It destroyed tanks, trucks, and bunkers. The TOW missile was a game-changer. It allowed the Army to engage armored targets from a distance, breaking the stalemate and turning the tide. But the cost was high. The loss rate for the Go-Go Bird was higher than for the standard CH-47. The aircraft was vulnerable. The crews were exposed. The mission was dangerous. The Army weighed the trade-off. The firepower was worth the risk. The losses were acceptable. The decision was made. The Go-Go Bird continued to fly. The enemy respected the Go-Go Bird. They feared it. Knowing it could kill their armor and troops, they prepared for it by digging in, hiding, and waiting. The Go-Go Bird forced the NVA to change their tactics. They could no longer move in the open or park their tanks in the clear. They had to move at night, in the jungle, or hide in tunnels. The Go-Go Bird changed the battlefield, the war, and the outcome. The crews of the Go-Go Bird were not heroes. They were soldiers and professionals. They did their job. They flew the aircraft, fired the missiles, saved their comrades, killed the enemy, and survived. Or they did not. The records do not judge. The records only list the names, dates, and missions. The stories are lost, forgotten, and silent. The Go-Go Bird was a stopgap. It was a temporary solution. It was a desperate measure. It worked well, perhaps too well. The Army relied on it, depended on it, and needed it. The Go-Go Bird became indispensable, a legend, a myth, and a memory. The aircraft was retired. The missiles were removed. The crews were disbanded. The war ended. The Go-Go Bird disappeared. But the impact remained. The legacy endured. The lesson was clear. Innovation comes from necessity, desperation, and the will to survive. The TOW missile launcher is gone. The sponsons are rusted. The aircraft are scrapped. The crews are old. The memories are fading. The history is written. The truth is told. The Go-Go Bird was a flying coffin, a flying tank, and a flying miracle. It was a testament to the ingenuity of the American soldier, the courage of the American crew, and the power of the American spirit. The Go-Go Bird flew, fought, and won. The story is over. The chapter is closed. The book is done. We called it the flying coffin, not because we wanted to die, but because we knew we might. The phrase was not bravado. It was a statement of fact, a cold, hard truth that the crews whispered to each other in the mess halls and shouted over the rotors in the air. The nickname stuck. It traveled with the birds from Da Nang to Pleiku, from Saigon to the DMZ. It served as both a badge of honor and a curse, acknowledging the danger while accepting the duty. The men flew for each other, and because someone had to do the job, the psychological toll was immense. Rather than the dramatic trauma of the battlefield, it was a slow, grinding erosion of the soul defined by constant threat, never-ending noise, and isolation. The men carried the weight of the war in their heads, seeing ghosts of friends in the smoke, hearing voices of the dead in the static, and feeling the hands of the fallen on their shoulders. The trauma hardened them, making them stronger and better. though it also made them sadder. The fear was real. It stemmed not from failure, but from the unknown, the next mission, the next flight, the next explosion. The crews managed this fear by focusing on the task, trusting the machine, their crew, and themselves. They prioritized the process over the outcome, flying the plane, delivering the cargo, and coming home. The fear was a passenger that rode with them, but it did not drive. The technical details of the flight were a shield against the fear. Pilots watched the instruments, loadmasters monitored the cargo, and gunners scanned the horizon. The crew worked together as a single unit, moving, thinking, and surviving as one. Their professionalism was absolute, their competence undeniable, and their skill unmatched. The crews knew they were the best in the world, and so did the enemy and the world. The sensory experience of the cockpit was a mix of comfort and terror, filled with the smell of oil and sweat, the sound of engines and rotors, the feel of controls and seats, the sight of sky and ground, and the taste of coffee and cigarettes. While their senses were overwhelmed, their minds remained focused, bodies tense, and spirits calm. The crews found a strange peace in the chaos, a quiet center in the storm, and a moment of stillness in the motion. It was not happiness, but acceptance. It was enough. The quotes from the crews are stark, raw, and real. You don't think about dying. You think about living. You think about going home. You think about your family. You think about your friends. You think about the mission. The fear never goes away. It just gets quieter. It sits in the back of your mind. It watches you. It waits for you. It never leaves. We were professionals. We did our job. We didn't ask for praise. We didn't ask for glory. We just asked to come home. The words are simple, powerful, and true. The enemy respected and feared the crews. They knew the Chinooks were coming, carrying supplies and men. They shot at them and tried to kill them, but they failed. The crews survived, returned, and flew again. The cycle continued. The war went on. The fear remained. The courage endured. The mission was complete. The legacy was secured. The story was told. The truth was known. The flying coffin flew. The men flew. The war flew. The fear flew. The courage flew. The mission flew. The legacy flew. The story flew. The truth flew. The claim that the Chinook was invincible died in the mud of Cambodia. The myth of the flying coffin was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of the wreckage scattered across the jungle floor. When the birds fell, they did not leave clean exits. They left piles of twisted metal, burning fuel, and the personal effects of men who had no time to pack. The aftermath resembled a forensic accounting of failure and loss more than a battle. The incident on 31st of October, 1970, remains the darkest stain on the unit's history. A CH-47, call sign 66, was hit by a 1.5-inch anti-aircraft round. The shell pierced the tail boom, severing the hydraulic lines. The aircraft did not explode. It simply stopped flying and fell from the sky like a stone. The impact was silent at first, then a roar of fire as the fuel tanks ignited. The crew died instantly. There was no chance for a bailout or a prayer, only the sudden, violent end of a mission. The sensory details of the crash site are haunting. Burnt flesh mixed with the sweet scent of spilled JP4 fuel, while personal items scattered in the grass, a dog tag, a photograph of a wife, a crumpled letter from home, lay exposed. The wind whistled mournfully through the broken rotor blades, mimicking the cries of the dead. The survivors who found the wreckage spoke of a silence heavier than the noise of the guns, a silence that demanded attention and accused. You might think the loss of one bird was a tragedy. The loss of many was a catastrophe. The unit morale collapsed. The crews stopped talking and smiling, moving through the base like ghosts haunted by the faces of their friends who were now part of the wreckage. Fear was no longer a passenger. It was the pilot, controlling the flight and dictating the outcome. The crews knew that the next time they flew, they might not come back, and they accepted that truth with a cold, hard resignation. The records list the names, dates, and causes, but the records do not list the pain. That pain lives in the eyes of the survivors, the hands of the widows, and the hearts of the children who never met their fathers. The cost of the war was not just in the numbers, but in the lives themselves, high, human, and final. The NVA celebrated the losses, seeing the downed birds as a victory and believing that the American will was breaking. They were wrong. The American will did not break. It hardened. The crews returned to the sky, flying missions, delivering cargo, and bringing men home with grim determination and silent fury because they had to. The impact of the lost birds was profound. It changed the way the crews flew. They flew lower, faster, and harder, taking calculated, precise, and deadly risks. They trusted their machines, crews, and themselves, but they did not trust the sky. The sky was a liar, a killer, and a grave. The legacy of the lost birds is complex. It is a story of heroism, sacrifice, failure, redemption, love, and loss. It is a story of the American soldier, crew, and spirit. The Chinook flew, fell, and rose again. The story is not over. The chapter is closed. The book is done. The truth is told. The pain remains. The clock reads 0300 hours. The sky is black. The jungle below is a void. The Chinook rises from the tarmac at Pleiku. The engines whine. The rotors cut the humid air. The crew checks instruments while the pilot scans the horizon. The loadmaster secures cargo as gunners verify their weapons. The mission is simple. Fly the route, deliver the supplies, return to base. The mission is impossible. The enemy is waiting. The sky is full of death. The only chance is change. The old tactics were dead. The straight and level flight was suicide. The predictable routes were traps. The crews knew it. The commanders knew it. The enemy knew it. The solution was not more speed. The solution was not more armor. The solution was chaos. The new tactics relied on unpredictability, coordination, and sheer nerve. The Chinooks no longer flew alone. They formed packs, flanked by escorts, driven by purpose. The A-1 Cobra guarded the formation. The F-4 Phantom shielded the sky. The CH-47 struck as the hammer. The synergy was deadly. The enemy could not handle it. The coordination between the helicopter crews and the fixed-wing air support was the key. The F-4 Phantoms flew high, fast, and loud. They drew the enemy fire. They suppressed the anti-aircraft guns. They cleared the way. The A-1 Cobras flew low, fast, and quiet. They engaged the ground targets. They protected the Chinooks. They hunted the ambushers. The Chinooks flew in the middle, heavy and slow. They relied on the escorts. They trusted the air cover. They focused on the mission. The formation was a wall of steel and noise. It was a fortress in the sky. It was a nightmare for the NVA. You might think the NVA was helpless against this new tactic. They were not. They adapted. They upgraded radar, missiles, and camouflage. They learned to shoot through smoke, hide in trees, and wait for the Chinooks to land. The enemy was skilled, motivated, and dangerous. But they could not stop the flow. They could only slow it down and make it harder. The cost of resistance rose. The price of victory fell. The balance of power shifted. The sensory experience of the new tactics was different. The noise was louder. The smell was stronger. The fear was sharper. The crews felt the vibration of the escorts. They heard the roar of the phantoms. They saw the tracers of the cobras. They felt the protection of the formation. They knew they were not alone. They knew they were part of something bigger. They knew they were part of a machine. The machine worked. The machine killed. The machine survived. The crews were the gears. They turned. They grinded. They endured. The war was a machine. The crews were the fuel. The fire burned hot. The fire burned bright. The fire burned long. The records show the results. The loss rate dropped. The mission success rate rose. The supplies flowed. The troops were resupplied. The wounded were evacuated. The war continued. The tactics evolved. The crews survived. The enemy adapted. The cycle continued. The war went on. The tactics changed. The crews changed. The enemy changed. The war changed. The outcome was not predetermined. It was earned, paid for in blood and sweat, hard-won and real. The enemy respected the new tactics. They feared the formation. They knew the Chinooks were coming. The escorts were there, and the fire was coming. They prepared for it. They dug in. They hid. They waited. The go-go bird changed the battlefield. The new tactics changed the war. The outcome was clear. The American will was unbroken. The American spirit was unbroken. The American machine was unbroken. The war was lost. The tactics won. The crews survived. The legacy endured. The story is told. The truth is known. The tactics worked. The crews lived. The war ended. The peace began. The silence returned. The birds flew home. The crews went home. The war was over. The legacy remained. The tactics were written into history. The truth recorded. The story done. 16,000 losses. That is the official count of American aircraft destroyed in Vietnam. The CH-47 represents a small fraction of that total, yet its shadow is long. The tandem rotor design survived the war because it was indispensable. The lessons learned were etched into the metal of the survivors and the memories of the crews who flew them. The legacy is one of grit. Men and machines endured the impossible. The Chinook returned to the skies in later conflicts. It flew in Desert Storm, lifting tanks and troops across the sands. It flew in Afghanistan. navigating the treacherous mountain passes. It flew in Iraq, providing fire support and logistics. It proved its worth in every theater and reminded the world of its resilience in every mission. The design that was once called a flying coffin became a symbol of reliability. The crews who flew it carried the weight of history on their shoulders. They knew the cost of failure and the price of survival. They flew with precision, purpose, and pride. The sensory memory of the Chinook is vivid, the smell of jet fuel and cordite, the sound of the twin rotors chopping the air, the feel of the vibration in the floor, the sight of the jungle floor rushing up to meet you, the taste of fear and coffee. These sensations define the machine's soul, the crew's identity, and the war's legacy. They are remembered, honored, and respected. You might think the war is over. It is not. It lives in the veterans who carry the scars, the families who lost their loved ones, and the machines that still fly. The Chinook reminds us of the cost of freedom, the sacrifice of the brave, and the price of peace. The legacy is complex, painful, beautiful, and real. The enemy's assessment was wrong. They thought they could break the will of the American soldier, stop the flow of supplies, and kill the machine. They were wrong. The will did not break, the flow did not stop, the machine did not die. It adapted, evolved, and survived. The lesson is clear. Resilience is a choice. It is a decision to keep flying, to keep fighting, to keep living. The final flight of the CH-47 in Vietnam was uneventful. The bird landed, the crew disembarked, and the engines were shut down. The silence was deafening. The war was over, the peace uncertain, and the future unknown. The Chinook sat on the tarmac, a monument to the past and a promise for the future. It was a machine of war and hope, a symbol of loss and survival, a flying coffin and a flying ark. The names of the fallen are recorded, the dates of the losses are documented, the causes of the crashes are listed, the records are complete, the story is finished, the truth is told, the legacy is secured, the Chinook flies on. The crews remember, the war is gone, the peace is fragile, the future is bright, the sky is clear, the rotors spin, the engines roar, the machine lives, the men live, the war lives, the peace lives, the future lives. The only thing that got us home was luck and a full tank. That line appears in a debriefing report from a pilot who survived 30 missions over the Iron Triangle. He did not mean it as a joke, he meant it as a statistical observation. The men who flew the CH-47 knew the odds. They knew the anti-aircraft fire was getting better, they knew the terrain was unforgiving. They flew anyway. Not because they were reckless, because someone had to lift the ammo, someone had to bring the wounded down, someone had to keep the war moving forward. Inside the Chinook, the air grew hot and noisy, smelling of hydraulic fluid and stale sweat, while vibrations rattled teeth loose. In that environment, professionalism was the only religion. Pilots checked instruments with precision, crew chiefs maintained engines with obsessive care, and loadmasters secured cargo tightly. Trust existed between the crew and the machine, but never for the sky. You might think courage is the absence of fear. It is not. Courage is the presence of duty. The crews felt fear in their stomachs and hands, yet they did not let it stop them. They flew into fire, storms, and the unknown because it was their job, because they were Americans, and because they were men. The enemy respected their courage. North Vietnamese Army reports noted the stubborn persistence of the American helicopters. Enemy commanders realized they could not stop the flow, only slow it down, make it painful, and hope for a lucky shot. The Americans knew this, adapting and evolving to survive. The records are cold, listing names, dates, and causes of death, but omitting fear, pain, and love. These incomplete records leave the story unfinished, the truth untold, and the legacy unsecured. The Chinook flies on, crews remember, and while the war is gone and peace fragile, the sky remains clear as rotors spin and engines roar. The machine lives, the men live. The official file number is DA-PAM55-25. It is a dry, bureaucratic document listing CH-47 specifications, maintenance procedures, and safety protocols, but not the cost. That cost is paid in blood, tears, and silence. The airfield at Pleiku is now a rice paddy, the jungle having reclaimed the tarmac. Grass grows tall, birds sing, and the wind blows as memories fade, but the truth remains. The flying coffin flew, the crews survived, the war ended, and peace began. The story is done, the file closed, the case sealed, and the record final. The end.